Good evening, everyone. My name's Nate Fick, and with my colleagues Richard Fontaine and Kristen Lord, I run the Center for a New American Security, and it's our pleasure to welcome you this evening and to welcome one of the great journalists writing today, Rajiv Chandrasekaran, on the publication of his book, Little America, The War Within the War for Afghanistan. Rajiv wrote a portion of the book while a writer-in-residence at CNAS. He also spent some time at the Wilson Center, and he was at that time one of 3 writers-in-residence we currently have under our roof. We constantly need to be careful not to let CNAS become a homeless shelter for journalists. And 2 others currently at work, and we can look forward to their books over the coming year, are Yoki Dreesen from the National Journal and David Finkel, Rajiv's colleague at the Washington Post. Rajiv is a senior correspondent and associate editor at the Post. He's the author also of Imperial Life in the Emerald City. His book about Iraq, which was a finalist for the National Book Award, was named one of the New York Times 10 Best Books of the Year for 2007, and then was made into a movie, The Green Zone. I read Little America in 3 long sittings, and as a Marine who served in Helmand in 2001 and 2002, I admit that it was occasionally a painful experience. But I look forward to a conversation this evening, not only about the decision to put the MEB in Helmand, but also about the fidelity with which that decision was implemented by the Marines on the ground. And leading the conversation with Rajiv is Steve Coll. Steve is the president of the New America Foundation and a staff writer at The New Yorker, the author of 7 books, most recently Private Empire, ExxonMobil, and American Power. And we learned just this week that Steve is stepping down from the presidency of New America by the end of the year in order to write a follow-on to Ghost Wars, which I suspect was read by most of us in this room. Steve, as someone who knows a thing or two about running a think tank in Washington, I maybe can be the first to publicly commend you for the job you did at New America. I think in your 5 years you took a great institution and made it even greater, and it's a rare combination of skills to be an absolutely top-flight writer and journalist, and also a really superb leader and manager. So kudos and good luck with your next step. So this evening, Steve will lead a conversation for about 40 minutes with Rajiv, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. Our plan is to wrap the conversation at 7:15, and then the bar will be open in the back of the room. And the price of a drink ticket is to buy one of Rajiv's books at the table just over there. So again, thank you all for being here. Steve and Rajiv, over to you.
Thanks.
Well, thank you, Nate, and thank you all for being out. Great to see a crowd of this size. I think they're still bringing in chairs for those of you who are standing. So thanks for your patience. And Rajiv, congratulations. I mean, you've done it again. I'm sure a lot of people here read Imperial Life. It was an incredibly powerful book, and also powerful for being so compact and well chosen and emblematic of Baghdad in a certain time. And you've done it here, I think, just as well. And so I'm going to start with that terrible Charlie Rose question. Why did you write this book, Rajiv?
Well, I went to Afghanistan for the first time in this recent period in March of 2009. President Obama had just announced the first tranche of new troops to go there. A mutual colleague of ours at the Washington Post had urged me to go and see how that was going to be playing out on the ground. And I had met an old friend of mine who's a principal character in this book, Cale Weston, for a coffee around the time of Obama's inauguration, and he had told me that the Marines, led by General Nicholson, who is a good friend of his, would be heading there soon. And I thought, it's worth going out and seeing. And when I headed out, I did not think that there was a book in there. And if anything, I thought there would be a book that would be very different from everything I had seen in Iraq. The tale of how we actually managed to turn around a failing war in the late innings, of how we got the right people, we got the troops in the right places. We found, after years of strategic drift and inattention, with a president who decided refocus on Afghanistan, to draw the curtains in Iraq, there would be a very compelling tale there of how America was able to pull it off. But as I went back again and again, I found myself seeing a story play out that I wouldn't say was echoing everything that I saw in Iraq in 03 and 04, but certainly there were elements of it, and I started to come away with some very serious doubts about overall strategy and the disconnects between the discussion and debate here in Washington and what was playing out on the ground, and how that strategy was being operationalized by the generals and the field-grade officers on the ground in Afghanistan, as well as by diplomats and reconstruction workers. And the more time I spent both here and there, and more time probing those disconnects, I felt that there was a story to be told here that hadn't really been told, that wasn't a story that could be told simply within the walls of the Situation Room, nor was it a story that was told simply by spending a year with a platoon and being out there in the mud and seeing the war through a narrow soda straw, but one where I'd have to sort of report at that 30,000-foot level and then come to the ground level. And so over the course of 2.5 years, I traveled back and forth about 15 times to be able to report here and there and try to pull it all together.
Right, and that's obviously a great strength of your work in the Post and between these covers, and it lives in the book the way you travel back and forth. And so let's start with sort of the origins of this surge and some of the thinking or the diversity of thinking that surrounded it, both within the Situation Room but also among the field commanders. I'm sure there are quite a lot of strong feelings in this room about counterinsurgency and its efficacy as a doctrine, its relevance to American national security. What we can certainly start with is the observation that some kind of counterinsurgency theory or doctrine informed the strategy that unfolded under President Obama in 2009. However, we also know that it was not counterinsurgency doctrine that was backed up by the resources and the metrics that are normally associated with expeditionary control of foreign territory and populations, because the number of troops on the ground, at least initially, were not adequate to secure all of Afghanistan. And there also seems to have been, as you document, some divergent views among field commanders and architects of the war in Washington about how far we were going to go with counterinsurgency as in the manual. So give us a quick tour of that set of assumptions that sent all of this, all of these Marines and soldiers and national treasure to war under a particular doctrine coming out of Iraq. How would you map that set of assumptions?
Well, for me, it begins very early in the Obama presidency, when the Obama White House was confronted with sort of 3 separate reviews on the Afghan war, one coming from CENTCOM, one being done out on the theater, one being done by the Joint Staff. And the new White House decided it wanted to sort of pull all this stuff together, and it commissioned Bruce Riedel to do a review. And at that point, for the White House, there was as the Riedel review was moving toward endorsing a civ-mil counterinsurgency strategy, there was a sort of a price tag associated with that, and that was the outstanding troop requests that had been put up by General McKiernan, then the COM-ISAF, the top U.S. and NATO commander in Afghanistan. And that figure was about 30,000 troops, some of which he wanted right away, others of which could be deferred. And so for the White House, as it got its head around the thorny problem of Afghanistan and the question of what the U.S. strategy should be, and as it defined the goals fairly narrowly to defeat, dismantle, and disrupt al-Qaeda, or degrade, it may be one of the 3 Ds, and I keep mixing them up, but suffice it to say, to sort of focus on al-Qaeda. The strategy in Afghanistan, as it sort of moved toward embracing counterinsurgency, at that point it came with a cost. But just as the Riedel review was being finished, Admiral Mullen and Secretary Gates sacked McKiernan and brought in Stan McChrystal. And McChrystal then very quickly determined that that was not the right price tag. And then, but for the White House, when McChrystal's assessment came in and his follow-on troop request, that was a bit of a sticker shock. And for the president's civilian advisors, this was sort of an eye-popping moment. This was, we signed up for this, but we signed up for this thinking the cost was X, and now we're being told the cost is essentially X times 2. And that then led to, as we all know, this lengthy policy strategic review over the fall of 2009, where they started to question core assumptions of counterinsurgency strategy, started to really do the sort of rigorous work that hadn't been done during the initial review, which was a rushed process that didn't involve any field visits or a whole lot of wide consultation. And that's how you got to this sort of ultimate hybrid. And you had this deep division on the president's national security team, which has been well chronicled between the skeptical civilians and military officers who felt that a fully resourced counterinsurgency campaign was really the only viable strategy. Now, it's interesting to note.
So we do get a hybrid in the field, you're saying. And you almost get the impression, I don't want to oversimplify because it's a very complicated narrative, but you almost get the impression that the president is saying, I just want you to do whatever is necessary to focus on al-Qaeda. And those instructions are translated ultimately on the ground into a counterinsurgency campaign, even though the president is never persuaded that there is a logic chain between counterinsurgency and Helmand and his goal of defeat, dismantle, and et cetera, al-Qaeda.
Well, I'd go a little further than that. The president did sign off on what he deemed to be a limited counterinsurgency strategy.
So define that. What do you think he signed off on by way of limited counterinsurgency?
He wanted coin in a handful of areas, the handful of the most important, most strategic areas.
Was he picking those, or did the military pick those for him?
He did not pick them. He left it to the military. There was that 6-page term sheet that General Jones, then the National Security Advisor, gave to the military that sort of spelled out the fact that they wanted this to be narrow and targeted. The problem was the military then interpreted it in a different way. I would argue in a more expansive way than the White House wanted, and the way it was operationalized involved further commitments of troops to places that were not central to the core mission.
And when that expansion occurred, was it because the military wanted more territory covered, or that they wanted a form of counterinsurgency that was more expansive, more oriented towards civilian reconstruction, more oriented towards state building than the president had originally intended in your sense of what the evidence shows?
I think both. I think they felt that you couldn't just do an incredibly limited coin campaign. They didn't believe, in defense of the commanders, they didn't believe you had to do coin everywhere. But they certainly felt you had to do it in more places than the White House wanted. In McChrystal's defense, he, at least according to his advisors, didn't see the need to do coin in perhaps as many places as the Marines were in Helmand. And had he been able to essentially wipe the board clean and put the troops everywhere he would have wanted to, the laydown would have been different. But even a 4-star is limited in how you can move forces, given basing infrastructure and given all the logistical challenges in Afghanistan. But back to that second part of the question, they certainly felt that to do effective coin and to get a strategic effect to strengthen the Afghan government to a point where there would no longer be the risk of al-Qaeda elements moving back, you had to do coin in more places than the White House wanted. They identified 80 key terrain districts that they had to operate in, largely in the south and east of the country. And in those places, it wasn't just large numbers of conventional forces, but a full-on civ-mil strategy. So getting in there and rebuilding, or I should say correctly, building for the first time elements of local governance that most of these places never existed before and somewhat alien to the Afghans, and trying to connect Kabul down to these remote areas. And so they felt all this had to be done if they were going to get to that end state.
And I mean, this is a good pivot to Helmand, but I want to ask one more question about the kind of conceptual framework or the views within it. Coming out of Iraq and the success of the surge in Baghdad, I think we all understand with the benefit of hindsight that the hard edge of that coin strategy in Baghdad, the direct targeted attacks on Shiite militia cells, leadership, the kind of machine that rolled up so much of the insurgent base in Baghdad as violence was reduced, that was also a part of the plan, right? And so targeted killings, targeted strikes against Taliban leaders, and the use of information technology, surveillance technology, and special forces to make the Taliban feel the weight of American military capability across their leadership ranks in a way they hadn't before. That was part of the plan too, but that wasn't articulated so much in public discourse. And so how did that fit in the original idea of why this surge would stabilize Afghanistan adequately to create space for a state to arise and for al-Qaeda to be excluded?
Let me just step back for a second. I agree with you that those counter-terrorist activities in Iraq, largely led by the Joint Special Operations Command, led at that point by Stan McChrystal, played a determinative role in the turnaround in Iraq. But there was this other narrative that also took place, that it was this troop surge, the conventional troop surge in Baghdad, turned everything around. In my view, it catalyzed change, it accelerated change, but it didn't spark that change. You already had, what were once mixed neighborhoods in Baghdad turning into religiously segregated warrens where the troops could actually sort of be deployed to separate populations. You had Sunnis in Anbar province sort of willing to rise up against al-Qaeda, so you could then accelerate that by expanding the nascent Sons of Iraq movement. So you could use those troops to essentially accelerate factors that were already occurring on the ground. In Afghanistan, you had none of that. You were trying to sort of connect the government to a population, and the view was if you were going into these villages and providing security, then government would follow and people would sort of turn to the government for services and get off the fence or stop supporting the Taliban. But as we know in Afghanistan, in many cases to villagers, the government is even more rapacious to them than the Taliban. It's not that they have any great love for the zealotry of the Taliban, but the Talibs promise law and order, they promise efficient justice, they promise security, they promise not to sort of shake you down for bribes. Meanwhile, the warlords, in many cases the government apparatchiks, are preying on the people. And so when we went in with a counterinsurgency strategy and said we're going to bring the government to the people, a lot of the people said, whoa, we don't want more of that government. And we failed to grasp that early on. We eventually did, but early on, that the government was the problem, not the solution in many cases. But with regard to the role of special forces and of task force raids and such, a huge role in Iraq and a big role in Afghanistan. Not so much early on, because a lot of those operators and their infrastructure, the enablers they would call them, were still in Iraq, and it took a while for them to get there. So when Stan McChrystal got there in the summer of '09, he didn't have a lot of those resources he had a lot, but not the sort of resources that they had in Baghdad at his time, at his disposal then. It took a while for them to get there, and they really sort of got there in full force by the following year, and when Petraeus took over. But for the military, and there may be some in this room that will disagree with this, while that element was a key part of the overall campaign, for the coin crowd, they sought not initially to sort of make a big deal of it. Because of the very acrimonious debate between sort of those proponents of counterterrorism, Joe Biden and crowd, versus the coin crowd during the 2009 strategy review. So when a lot of those CT-type tactics were actually starting to have a real effect, they were always framed as, oh, this is an element of the overall coin strategy, as opposed to sort of saying, oh, well, this was actually the part of it that the other side said would be most effective in Afghanistan.
Right. Okay, so we've set the stage for an important decision, which is the decision to go to Helmand. Why did we go to Marja?
We went to Marja because, as General Larry Nicholson described it, it was a cancerous hole in the middle of Helmand. Marja, of all of Helmand, Marja was probably the one place that really did deserve additional forces and a real sort of concentration. It was a
Taliban mini-state, basically.
Yes, with lots of drug processing labs and lots of bomb factories.
And so then pull the lens back.
Yep.
And if the president has in mind this limited counterinsurgency campaign, he's delegated to the military commanders thinking about exactly where to deploy troops, where to secure territory, where to apply coin most aggressively. How is it, a theme in your book, it seems to me, is the cost of investment in Helmand at the expense of Kandahar
Yes.
and other campaign priorities. So who is responsible for the decision to load as much of the U.S. surge into Helmand as we did?
Well, it goes back to World War II. It goes back to battles the Marines were fighting on islands in the Pacific where they felt they weren't getting enough air cover from the Navy. And since then, the Marines have insisted on deploying what they call a MAGTAF, a Marine Air Ground Task Force. So they want to bring their own helicopters. They want to bring their own logisticians and engineers. And that requires what they call contiguous battle space. To put it in a different term, their own patch of the sandbox. And so when Obama signed off on those first 17,000 troops, they needed to be sourced from somewhere. And Big Army, at that point, had more than 100,000 troops in Iraq. They had some 50,000 or so already in Afghanistan. They didn't have a lot of troops on offer. The Marine Corps, at that point led by Jim Conway, who was the commandant, wanted to get out of Anbar because there weren't enough bad guys to kill there. It was turning into a policing mission as he saw it. He wanted into Afghanistan, and so he was willing to offer up troops, but they would come with a set of conditions. And among those conditions were that the Marines would deploy as a MAGTAF. They wanted contiguous battle space. So you couldn't really put them in Kandahar because they'd have to be interoperable with U.S. Army units and, more importantly, with Canadian forces. It was too hard to sort of give them their own airspace in Kandahar, even if that was the most important place in the south. So they got part of central Helmand that the British were willing to vacate, a part of the country. Now, if your strategy is counterinsurgency, right, you're supposed to be protecting the people, you're supposed to be with the people. We sent 10,672 of the initial tranche of 17,000 forces to a part of the country with 1% of the population, but because they could carve it out for themselves. Now, even if you did that, that 1% of the population, that area, that part of the sandbox included Marja, this cancerous hole. So why not go there first? Well, Larry Nicholson went in to go see General McKiernan on his pre-deployment survey, and he said, well, General, if this is the worst place we've got, we should go there first. It was a rational thing to think and to ask for. But McKiernan turned him down because he didn't want to risk the images in Afghanistan of bloody fighting in the run-up to the presidential election that August. So he said, no, we'll do that later. So Nicholson committed his forces elsewhere, to places, I would argue, that were less strategically important than Marja or Kandahar, but informed from his experience in Iraq when the Marines pulled out forces from the Euphrates River Valley to assault Fallujah, only to have the insurgents move into those communities, kill a lot of people who had worked with the Marines. Once moving into places like Nawa and Garmsir and Kanashin, these districts along the Helmand River, if he was going to commit forces there, he wasn't going to pull them out in 6 months. And he made that clear. So what that meant was by not allowing the Marines to go to Marja first, that if they were going to do Marja, they'd need more forces. And that was one of the arguments that McChrystal made in asking for surge forces. So, this is sort of a two-level mistake in my view. The Marines and that Marine unit, the Marine Brigade led by Nicholson, did some extraordinary work. They've just recently been told they're being awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, which is one of the highest honor that can be given to an entire unit in the military. My question is, should they have been doing that PUC-worthy work in a more essential part of southern Afghanistan. But even if they got to Helmand, shouldn't they have been focused on the worst part of Helmand as opposed to some of these other areas?
And were these questions asked in real time inside the Situation Room?
No.
And why do you think they were not?
It was a limited knowledge of Afghanistan among the new team coming in. Those 17,000 forces were sort of billed to the president as necessary to help Afghanistan conduct its presidential election. The truth is, those forces went to a lot of places where electoral fraud was the worst. They actually protected polling places where they actively stuffed ballot boxes for Hamid Karzai. But there never was a rigorous discussion that said exactly how we're going to use these forces, where are they going, and with a lot of real discussion. There were some, but it didn't get that detailed. And I'm not suggesting that the president should be out there picking bombing targets like LBJ did. But if you're going to be the first wave of troops you're committing in your presidency, shouldn't you be more engaged with at least whereabouts they were going, how they were going to be used? This was a majority of those forces, and that discussion never really took place in a robust way.
Was there a discussion about East versus South at that time?
Yes and no. The East at that point was seen to be going pretty well. The narrative around the East was that we're making great progress there. That's where the Americans were. The East was the regional command that the U.S. had since the beginning, and so we had created a narrative that this was going to be great, and it was the South, which was run by our NATO partners, that was the part of the country that we saw as flagging.
Yeah. Well, we started a little late, so I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and run our conversation a little bit. Because I wanted to ask about two other things. One is there's a very powerful, compact narrative of the infighting within the administration that proceeds from the strategic review all the way forward. The distaste among Doug Lute, who's still Deputy National Security Advisor in charge of Afghanistan and Pakistan, for Richard Holbrooke, late Richard Holbrooke, and also the episodes involving Ambassador Eikenberry, and a more generalized intensity of personal discord that, it seems to me, you pretty explicitly say undermined the cohesion of the war effort. And you sort of ask, it seemed to me, as I was reading, where is the president these are his advisors, if this discord is serious enough to undermine his objectives, isn't it ultimately his responsibility to end it? So I wondered, do you think he understood the degree of animus that's documented in this book? And if he did, why did he not do something about it?
The real tragedy here is that all of these senior actors who are fighting amongst themselves, Lute, Eikenberry, Holbrooke, and others, they were largely of a similar view on Afghanistan. They were skeptical of counterinsurgency and the surge. They wanted to see a degree of negotiation with the Taliban. They had grave doubts about the Karzai government. Had they decided to work together, they could have actually presented a fairly potent front to the military commanders arguing for a different set of outcomes. But they were so consumed fighting themselves that the military was able to come in and in many cases early on, get its way. This was a degree of fighting that was known to the president. I recount a story in this book after Jim Jones's sort of second attempt to fire Holbrooke. Holbrooke then calls Secretary of State Clinton, reaches one of her aides. They were traveling in Saudi Arabia at the time. And when she gets back to Washington, she marches in to see the president and says, Mr. President, you can fire Richard Holbrooke over the objection of your Secretary of State. He fully knew, I think, what was going on. The level of the infighting at the staff level, perhaps not.
But did he stay the course? I wondered if he stayed the course because the senior cabinet, the senior war cabinet, Clinton, Panetta, and Gates, were in fact united on the policy that the commanders were pursuing and not fighting with each other.
I think in the case of Holbrooke, he didn't sack him because he was protected by Clinton. And it's an extension of the whole Tevam rivals approach. Secretary Clinton under sort of the unspoken terms of her appointment as Secretary of State, would have free reign to appoint whom she wanted to in the department. And so if he was going to sack Holbrooke, who also happened to be a good friend of hers, somebody who was, a loyal ally of both Clintons, that was going to come at a great political cost. And I'm not sure he wanted to absorb that. At the same time, he never then told his staff, all right, Holbrooke, even though we may not like him, is the guy here, we have to work with him. Instead, simply let them fight amongst themselves. But I can't sit here and say that he knew the depth of the infighting. Did he know that the NSC staff was actively denying Holbrooke the use of military aircraft, or scheduling meetings when he was out of town, or trying to slip the president talking points to undercut Holbrooke after trying to exclude him from Oval Office meetings with Karzai? There were elements of that I'm pretty sure that the president would not have known.
Right. So just 2 or 3 more minutes. Kandahar.
Yep.
We arrived there in your narrative, as we did in real time, a little after the surge into Helmand. And you have quite a lot of vivid on-the-ground reporting about the efforts there once the transition from the Canadians got underway. What is your thumbnail report card about the successes and failures of the campaign in Kandahar once it began?
Well, from a military point of view, I think the surge forces did some great work in the areas around Kandahar, in the districts of Arghandab and Zari, and more recently in Panjwai. There was a lot of special forces activity, but the conventional forces did play a big role. Where there are much bigger questions in Kandahar was the issue of what was our political engagement? What was our strategy with Ahmed Wali Karzai, the late half-brother of the president, who was the unquestioned power broker down there? And so as we were surging in all these forces, we were still very sort of schizophrenic about what we were doing. We were going to try to bypass him and build new government. And it wasn't until very late that a more pragmatic view took hold, that we should actually deal with this guy. And I recount the efforts by a one-star general out there, a guy named Coll, who's now a 2-star and just got back to IJC in Kabul. He looked at the governor's palace, Governor Wisa of Kandahar, who we were trying to work with. We, lots of state and aid guys with him, trying to funnel projects through him. He was our man. You go to his office, the governor's palace. The place was a mausoleum. There was nobody in there. It was the governor and like 5 aides, and a bunch of Americans and at one point Canadians. And then you go over to Ahmed Wali's place at the provincial council, and it's teeming with people. A little queue of people outside, people packed in the halls. And he asked himself, well, why are we trying to build governance here when all the governance is really taking place over there? And if that's who the Afghans are looking at, even though he's a deeply flawed individual, shouldn't we try to work with him, try to mitigate his worst tendencies if the time frame is narrow, if the resources are limited? But this, of course, ran counter to what the U.S. Embassy wanted to do, so he and others on the regional command staff essentially sort of freelanced their own policy there. But that came at a cost. It was much later into the overall Kandahar operation, and so we had a complete disconnect between the sort of the security and political tracks down there.
Where's this going to end?
It's going to end. Look, my crystal ball is as good or as bad as any of us in this room. But my sense is it's going to end up in sort of a messy but manageable state. I don't think any of us are going to be able to look at Afghanistan in 5 years or 10 years and say that's a neat and tidy, secure, stable nation state. But I don't see the Taliban rolling back into Kabul as they did in the 1990s. Will they own pockets of the country, some districts, some valleys? Sure.
They already do, I think.
Yeah, they do, of course. Maybe a few more. Will the Haqqanis expand their presence in some areas? Yes. Will there continue to be sanctuaries in Pakistan? Most likely. But I think it'll be sort of a messy state, violent, but the center will probably hold. The major cities will hold. If the Afghan security forces are continue to receive funding from the outside and some degree of mentorship and training. The hope is that they will not be sort of pulled apart by ethnic tensions and will serve as a tool to unite the nation. I mean, it's odd to think that Pakistan serves as some example for Afghanistan, as failed of a state as is. But if the ANA can serve as a tool of keeping the nation together as a respected institution there, that being the Afghan army, that's maybe sort of the least worst outcome that we have. My enduring question in all of this, though, is this messy outcome one that we could have achieved with fewer resources going in, with fewer lives lost, fewer limbs lost, fewer billions of dollars expended between 2009 and now? And could we have achieved the security objectives of the United States and gotten to a similar end state with less blood and treasure?